So I'm going to get started. Hello, my name is Nandita Raghuram. I am the Deputy Opinion Editor at the Chronicle of Philanthropy.
And my name is Manu Meel. I'm the CEO of BridgeUSA, and it's great to be here with everybody.
So we're here today to talk about the new generation of young people who are leading nonprofits, in increasing numbers. I think anyone working in philanthropy and nonprofits knows that more and more young people are, including those in Gen Z as well as younger millennials, are entering nonprofit careers with big ideas, fresh thoughts on how to enact change, both within the nonprofit and philanthropy fields and for society as a whole, right? In some ways, both fields have accommodated these new faces and new ideas, but in other ways, they haven't been so welcoming. With many young people reporting challenges tied to burnout and low salaries, while also questioning whether certain ingrained practices and methods of confronting social challenges within the field need to be re-examined and perhaps even changed. But leaders of any generation know that, they need to welcome these young people. As the nonprofit and philanthropy fields are facing workforce shortages. So the Chronicle of Philanthropy today has gathered three young leaders in the nonprofit and advocacy space, ranging in age from high school to their late 20s, to have a conversation about all those issues, about their experience as young leaders in the field, the challenges they faced in their work, and ways in which the nonprofit and philanthropy fields can do better to support them in their growth.
So I couldn't agree with you more, Nandita. I think this conversation is super important, and I'm very excited to introduce all three of our young leaders that are going to be leading the conversation with us today. So first, we've got Sam Bilal. He's the co-director of Youth Climate Strike LA. He's 22 years old, and the organization's been building for 5 years. Really excited to hear your perspective, Sam. The second speaker we have today with us is Anthony Sartori. He's an executive director and founder of an organization called Evolving Minds. Anthony is 28 years old, and the organization's been building for the last 4 years. And last but not least, we have Esme Hyatt, who leads an organization called the Extinction Rebellion Youth Los Angeles. Esme is 18 years old, and the Extinction Rebellion organization has been building for 5 years. So thank you all so much for joining, and I appreciate everybody that is going to take the time to listen. I guess the first question that we have for you all is really about what are you actually working on, and importantly, what draws you to the work that you picked today. So the first question we have is, why did you choose the field that you're engaged in right now, and what would you like people to most know about your work and what you do? Maybe Sam, I introduce you first. Would you like to kick it off?
For sure. What's up, everyone? My name is Sim Bilal. I'm from South LA. And I think a lot of what sort of driven my work and, really started my interest in the field of climate organizing and climate justice, the fight for climate justice, was so my organization, Youth Climate Strike LA, we were founded in 2019, by high school students, and a lot of high school students from like either the gateway cities or the inner cities. And the reason why we started YCSLA was that we weren't seeing any action from the adults in power, specifically when it comes to our neighborhoods. We have some of the highest levels of pollution, lead contamination, air pollution. We have freeways that cut through our neighborhoods, rail yards. A lot of times there are oil drilling, airports, just to name a few, landfills, etc. And so, really sort of creating that bridge between multiple communities that were facing similar issues, but with maybe, slightly different demographics. And so for me, like I think a lot of what sort of pushed me or motivated me was when I was 5 years old. My grandma, she got cancer because of where she was living and working in Signal Hill, which has like some of the worst like oil extraction in the United States. And I just, I think seeing her get really sick and then understanding like why this was happening, and she was only 50 years old, like it was a tragedy to lose her so young. And for me, like, just watching her suffer, watching my mom deal with that too, and then recognizing like there was this external force and entity that was causing this and that would never be held accountable, and that would continue to do harm to my community and the people that I care about and I love. And, also to myself, like these fossil fuel industries are not just destroying our neighborhoods right now, they're also, destroying our future. And so for me, like it was a no-brainer to start organizing and I started when I was 15 with Earth Guardians, and then in 2019 started doing youth climate strike stuff. But yeah, that's like a lot of my reasons and drive for this. And so a lot of the work that we do right now is really shifting the power of young people to self-governance, self-determination. And we did a lot of, electoral work in 2022. We do some policy and legislative work as well. But at the bulk of it, we're fighting for investments into our communities so that we can determine, what we need to survive. I think a lot of times people send in their fancy experts or people that they think they know everything about our communities because they read us as a bunch of statistics, but in reality, these are people living their lives on the ground that have been working to protect our communities for a long time, up to 30 years. And so really trusting the guidance from our elders and the lived experience of the people that have been in our communities for a long time, but also welcoming in this new wave of new energy, new ideas, and new perspectives into challenging the status quo. That's yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Sim. And importantly, thank you for sharing your personal story, because I think a lot of people at this moment go through those types of hardships, and some of us don't resort to the path that you've taken. And so kudos to you for not only grinding towards that vision, but appreciate you sharing that, because that really gets at the why behind why a lot of young people are getting involved in different sort of areas. So with that, Anthony, what drew you to what you do, and why are you so passionate? What would you like the world to know?
A little bit ago, I attended a funders panel in DC, well-established funders. And there was an executive director of a well-established nonprofit that was introducing them to the audience and thanking them because they were funding their nonprofit. Fast forward to the conference lunch, I sat down next to one of the staff members of that nonprofit that was being funded by those funders on the panel. And I told them a little bit about the work that we do at Evolving Minds. We're advancing healthy work cultures in the nonprofit sector. And midway through the conversation, they looked at me and they said, "I can't believe I'm about to tell you this. I mean, you're a stranger. This is a conference, but I'm not out at my job." And for me in that moment, to hear that experience, that lived experience, to look into that other human being's eyes, and then to see the direct link between the funders, the funder panel, funding that organization, and staff in that organization not feeling a sense of belonging. The reason that I am so passionate about this work and what draws me to this work is that millions of workers, especially in the nonprofit and the philanthropic sector, do not feel a sense of belonging in their workplace. And belonging is a core and fundamental human need. It's essential for our well-being and our survival. And at Evolving Minds, that's what we seek to do, is to build healthy workplaces where people can feel safe and protected from harm and in community with each other.
Thanks, Anthony. Esme, would you like to round us out with what drew you to this work?
Yeah, of course. So I first learned about climate change when I was 12 years old. It wasn't because I learned about it in school. It was just because I read an article online. And that really kind of gave me a lot of anxiety because I hadn't been learning about it in school. I hadn't heard anyone talk about it to the extent that it really was an issue. So I started to have a lot of anxiety around that. And then I learned around the age of 14 that actually if you do something to combat climate change, or if you get involved, it can really lower that anxiety that people feel that oh, this is such a big issue. This is we're not going to solve climate change. So I got involved with Extinction Rebellion Youth Los Angeles in 2020. And basically what we do is we fight to prevent ecological collapse. So we fight to stop climate change. We want environmental justice, and honestly working with a group of individuals towards a common goal made it feel a lot more achievable and made it feel like there's a end goal. So that was really good in, one, combating my anxiety around the climate crisis, but also just knowing that if anyone felt that way too, they could join and have a community where we're all striving for the same goal.
Thanks, Esme. I mean, I have to say 15, 14, Anthony, you getting inspired by a panel. I have no idea what I was doing at that time, but I just have to applaud you for sort of the initiative and the effort you've taken. I think it's important for people in this space to see that. So the last question I have before I swing it back over to Nandita is, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but what do you think about our generation, Gen Z, makes us particularly well suited for careers in the nonprofit world? What do you think about our generation's experiences might make us more apt towards working in this space? So maybe Anthony, if you want to kick it off first.
I think that from my experience of working with Gen Z and millennials for almost a decade now, I think a common experience is that many young people are suffering. We're in this epidemic of a youth mental health crisis. And there's so many worldly crises that are taking place. And in conversation and talking with young people, I think what is so compelling is that, yes, there's this experience of suffering, and there's a desire to alleviate that suffering. There's a desire to want to do something, to make the world a better place, to do good in the world, to give back. So I think what gives me hope from working closely with Gen Z and millennials is this really profound feeling of compassion for the world, and for suffering. And so
Thanks, Anthony. Sim?
Yeah. So the question was like, what challenges?
What do you think makes Gen Z particularly suited towards this work, and what do you think are some unique experiences that make us well positioned to be doing nonprofit work?
Well, I mean, I feel like first off the bat, like our generation has felt like an immense amount of failure from the people that were elected to sort of protect us. Like I think growing up in this sort of world where we don't have, I think, equal rights or equal say as like citizens in the US, because we can't vote, or we don't have fair input. We don't have the same financial power as adults that have been alive much longer than us. And then to sort of have the internet, I think, be that sort of that contradiction and expose the ban on books, to expose the attacks on abortion, to attack Republicans for refusing to ban assault rifles. That how many of us have literally had to practice barricading our schools, or how many of us have woken up to headlines and had to see children gunned down in their classrooms. Like, these are not normal things, and we have experienced them our entire lives. And so we're uniquely positioned in a way because the internet, but because just our lived experience in that community that we have born by connecting with each other, to try to challenge and to really assert ourselves into positions to defend our basic lives and our basic rights as human beings. Because it's clear, like, we're not seen as humans by or as equal humans by a lot of the adults in power. And so I think to be confronted with that reality at such a young age, but to realize that no one is coming to save you, that really does click a switch in your head. You realize that you have to do all of this stuff by yourself, and you're going to do it with your friends, like Esme is saying. Like, we really find community within ourselves. And I think a lot of times it's because the adults in power have shut the door in our faces. They say that their profits are worth more than our lives, and that's essentially what they're saying every time they refuse to ban assault rifles, every time that they refuse to challenge the education system that wants to ban books, and the folks in power that are doing that stuff. Like, I think it's clear, like, that there is like this this systemic issues, these systematic issues that have been barreling down on us for decades and for generations. And I think it's finally met its match with our generation. Like, we're not going to lay down and take there's shit. And so I think people are, I think, uncomfortable with that in a lot of traditional or establishment spaces, whether it's the legislator, whether it's nonprofit spaces. Like, they don't like being confronted by young people standing up for themselves and saying, no, we're not going to take your shitty ass wages, or we're not going to take abuse in the workplace, or we're not going to take this nonsense. Like, I think they finally met their match with us. And so I see a lot of headlines come out about how generations are hard, how Generation Z is the hardest generation to work with. I mean, I think if we've been attacked systematically for our entire lives, and told that we're worthless compared to bullets, compared to oil, compared to everything else, of course we're going to cause problems in the workplace. Like, we know our worth. And so I think if that's a problem for folks, I think they need to really get in touch with why they feel so challenged by people standing up for themselves and demanding basic human rights. But yeah.
Sam, I'm just curious. I know this is a little off, but I'm just curious. How much do you think within our generation, how relevant and prevalent do you think that perspective is across Gen Z? And do you think that most young people in our generation share that view? Because I think that a lot of folks in positions of power and a lot of people in the philanthropy space are definitely curious about where does Gen Z stand on a lot of these issues? How does Gen Z think about the prevalence of these issues? What's your perspective on that? And if you could just be brief, and then I'll go to Esme. But I'm just curious because I think people would be interested in knowing that.
For sure. And yeah. And I want to preface this by, like, I can't speak for everyone in my generation. We have such a diversity of opinions and views and backgrounds and experiences. However, I think across the board, like what we're seeing right now is, every single labor protection we have, the fact that we even have Memorial Day off on Monday, like, people fought for that. They fought for the 8-hour work week. They fought for weekends. And that made sense back then when they fought for it. And so now we're entering like this new wave where we have AI, where we have, our employers able to text us like 24 hours a day to be able to reach us like that. I think that there are more boundaries that need to be set up, and they need to be clear. Like, there needs to be distinctions between how much work you're actually asking me to do and how productive I am. We're entering a time where we're more productive than ever in history. And the fact that, corporations, nonprofits, or whoever is just demanding more, and we just can't keep up with it. So of course we have a mental health crisis, or of course we have an epidemic. I mean, even looking at like how they treat us in schools, like a lot of my friends that are, still in high school or graduating this year, they have ridiculous amounts of workload for AP classes. And we don't look at like, oh, they're just learning, but like, you have to really take into account like how much homework are you actually asking these kids to do when they get home, how they're sitting in school like 8 hours a day. Most of them have like 12 different extracurriculars. Like, you're just taking so much and not returning anything. Or, and it's just like, for me, it's frustrating because I saw this sort of trend emerge in high school when one of my friends that were in Vex Robotics with me, they committed suicide. Like, and then, we're poised to go to these really big universities that just demand more. And like, in reality, like, we're so productive, but we cannot keep up with this level of demand and extraction. Like, it's just not going to work. But I think that is like across the board a lot of the same frustrations I'm seeing, whether it's with my friends that are starting to enter the workforce right now, or my friends that are still in school right now. Like, they're just demanding so much of us, and we just can't keep up.
Thanks,
but
Sam.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Esme, do you want to wrap us up, and then I'll switch it over to Nandita?
I think a lot of the issues that Gen Z is facing have kind of reached a boiling point, and we've understood like the fact that like enough is enough. So we definitely feel the pressure to, go into like careers or work with nonprofits and advocacy, because we know that like that can make a difference even if we're not in a huge like position of power. And I would also say that we kind of have a mindset that isn't really into the system yet. There's a concept of like, oh, this issue, we don't have to deal with it sometimes, that I think adults have, or because like they've heard so many people in their lives tell them like, we can't deal with this isn't okay, like this isn't okay, but we can't do anything to solve it. That I think Gen Z and millennials are particularly like, they don't want to be complicit in that, which I think is really beneficial, because everyone I know who's in Gen Z or who's a millennial is incredibly driven and wants to work on these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. You all kind of mentioned doing work that makes huge changes in the world, and how your age in particular helps you make those changes. Esme, you mentioned it makes you really well suited to help people and see what's wrong with the world and want to make a difference. I'd like to switch gears a little to kind of talk about the other side of that. What are some roadblocks you've personally encountered as a young leader in the nonprofit and advocacy space? Esme, I'll start with you because it kind of ties into what you just said.
I would definitely say burnout is something that I've faced before and that I know everyone or a lot of people in the group have and in I don't know, the youth climate movement in general, because it's like you're working, and sometimes you're not seeing results. And that can be really just it's not always good for yourself because it's like you just try and try. So I think it's definitely hard to combat that, but it's something that as like an organization, like we're trying to really make sure that everyone like checks in before, that we understand why we're doing it, that we debrief like every action we do, our feelings about the action, that we allow people to take breaks when they need it, because those breaks can sometimes be just as beneficial to like get the ground running again. So yeah, I definitely say burnout.
And do you have a sense of like what the fields can do on a broader scale, like, outside of what your organization is doing? How can the field address this very pervasive issue of burnout that, affects folks of any age?
I would say providing mental health resources is one thing, and because one, like so many people can benefit from that, and it's clear that a lot of people need to. But also I would just say like listening to our issues, because sometimes personally for me, what like when I become burned out, I realize that I've been working so hard, but I've also at the same time been looking at like the state of the world and realizing that maybe my voice isn't making that much of a difference. Um, and honestly, like if we could just get to a place where everyone's really supporting like the youth climate movement and listening to our demands and putting them, I mean, I know this is optimistic in a sense, but like putting them into place, I think that would honestly combat burnout, because we would feel like more sense of wins and also just a sense that like people have our back.
Yeah, particularly like the adults who are making decisions, like understanding that this is real and this needs to change. Anthony, I'll turn to you. Can you talk through some roadblocks you've personally encountered as a young leader in the nonprofit space? And I know your organization also specifically deals with mental health at work. So it seems like you'll have a lot to say about that, as well as dealing with burnout specifically.
I think the burnout that stems from trying to create change internally within an organization. I joined a board of another nonprofit about 2.5 years ago. And it was a legacy nonprofit, meaning that it was founded by all white people, funded by majority white wealth. And for many, many years, a decade or more, it was just trying to get to a place of centering equity and really breathing and living its values of inclusivity. And it really struggled. So I joined to support their diversity, equity, inclusion efforts internally, and really faced an enormous amount of resistance within the organization, within our DEI committee, working with workers of color to try and change the culture of the organization. And ultimately, we failed in our efforts. And I think what was remarkable about that moment to me was there was at that time that we were going through constant chaos and conflict, which is pretty normal in a workplace, unfortunately. We were going through a brand refresh. So we were changing our name, our logo, our website, our colors, our icons. And we were sending that out to the funder landscape, to our philanthropist partners, and saying, look what we're doing here, look how amazing this is. And we were getting a lot of people like, wow, this is great, this is awesome. We're so excited for your new chapter. And at the same time that that's happening, I'm getting calls from staff members who are saying this workplace is traumatic and dehumanizing. So from my experience, there's a monumental disconnect between the reality of nonprofits and the reality of funders. There's really a canyon in between. It's a dark, deep, lonely canyon. And there's just a monumental disconnect. And for me, some of the biggest roadblocks that's caused the most amount of burnout over the past 4 years is the lack of transparency and authenticity. Those are core values of mine. I know that both Gen Z and millennials really strive to achieve those values as well and live and breathe that. So to face that, to try and make change as a young person in an organization and to not really move the bar forward, it can often feel demoralizing.
So how would you address those issues of transparency? Like, what do you think the field should do to alleviate that or make things more transparent?
One, I think we all need to collectively acknowledge that we are not okay. We are in beyond a burnout crisis, we are in an existential sector-wide questioning of our identity that has not stopped. And so, yeah, I think collectively acknowledging this could be really helpful. And then I think beyond including acknowledging the problem that exists, not glossing over, is really investing in people. So as we know, the foundation, the philanthropic sector has really struggled for decades and decades to invest in the people, in the health and well-being of organizations, the culture. So I think that's another way to address that. And then I think the third is really an emerging theme of like, how do we build trust and authenticity between nonprofits and funders? And I think we need programs that do that. I think we need scalable programs that get funders and nonprofits together to build really meaningful social relationships and connections that can help really bridge that canyon of kind of the challenges that nonprofits face and really helping their immediate reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Sim, I'll turn to you, and before I turn it over to Manu to ask another question, but Sim, can you talk a little bit about any roadblocks you've encountered as a young leader in this space, including burnout, as well as how to, overcome those roadblocks and address things like burnout?
Yeah, I think for me the biggest thing definitely has been like gatekeeping, because I think there's a lot of like legacy nonprofits like Anthony sharing that have been in the field for 30, 40 years. And the only way that they can maintain, I think the whole purpose of a nonprofit, right, is to make yourself obsolete, right? So you're supposed to be solving and addressing the problem of the community so that for the work that you're doing is no longer needed. But I think in reality, what we're seeing is that people are so concerned with chasing, grants and chasing the dollar and chasing the buck that they sacrifice the needs of their community in order to, maintain this legacy. Like, why do you need a nonprofit to exist for 80 years or like for 50 years? Like, if you're existing that long, you're not, addressing the problem that you set out to solve in the first place. And a lot of times what we see is that they become a part of the problem. And so we have like a lot of big greens and maybe I'll, like we have like Sierra Club or like NRDC, like really like established green organizations that have been causing harm and extracting from our communities since the 80s, but they're still allowed, to operate and to apply for grants and then to compete with a lot of community led smaller community owned nonprofits, right? And then it just becomes like this competition where we can't compete because they have huge amount of grant writing staff and grant officers that get the money, and then who knows what they do with the money. But like, we're not seeing it in our communities, we're not seeing the effects play out across the most impacted groups. And I think folks really need to grapple with that. I think the entire field of philanthropy and nonprofits need to assess like, what have we really done in the last 30, 40 years? Like what have we really accomplished, and like who have we really like hurt, and who have we really harmed, and how can we really center the needs of these communities that we've extracted from? Like, we've taken their stories, we're taking their perspectives, we're taking their knowledge, and we're not returning anything. And so it just leaves this huge like void and this hole that I think many of us feel as I think people become like jaded and they become burnt out and they have all these issues that they're dealing with. But I think at the core of it is like, we just cannot compete. And I also think like, what Anthony is saying too about like philanthropy and organize and nonprofits and organizations need to come together to like sort of assess this stuff. And I agree, because a lot of times, like these philanthropy groups or whatever, they'll send out like grants specifically what they want to focus on. But like if you're, you know, high in the castle in the clouds or whatever, how do you really know what's going on the ground to like decide, okay, let's make this pathway for funding, but if the funding doesn't, you know, directly relate to what the folks on the ground need, like how is that helping? Like it's really just helping your ego. It's helping you, you know, feel better about what about, you know, how your family made money or how your foundation made money, instead of really grappling like what is actually happening on the ground. And I think that's the biggest problem that I'm seeing, is that like we have all these groups trying to chase and compete for funding. The funding doesn't match, or like the parameters of the funding or deliverables don't match what we actually need in our communities. And it's just that huge disconnect where it's not making sense, where, you know, a lot of groups I know don't want to apply for funding or don't want to apply for grants because A, they know that they're not going to get it because they can't compete, or B, it's just not relevant to what we're actually experiencing and doing on the ground. And so I think, you know, and all of that leads to burnout because we're trying to find resources and trying to balance all this shit, but like it's just not happening because we don't have the capacity. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks everybody. That was fascinating. So here's what I'm curious about. So if I'm listening to this, right, and I hear three leaders, and let's say that I agree with everything you said, right, and I find that you three should be in the nonprofit world to the end of time. We got to nurture and grow so that the sector improves and advances. What would you tell people that are thinking about and hearing what you're saying? How would you help them understand Gen Z better? What would you tell them to do to better understand our generation? And importantly, and this is something I want to be clear on, the demographic, ethnic diversity across the generation, and also the ideological diversity across this generation. So how do you help people? What would you tell them to help them understand Gen Z at this moment? So maybe Esme, would you like to go first?
I would say that a lot of Gen Z feels like a moral obligation to fight for these issues, but also not just a moral obligation, like a literal necessity of life. In terms of the climate crisis, a lot of people don't have access to clean water, they don't have access to clean air. And if they have it right now, they know that in the future that's not going to be the case. So when you talk about like, you know, like if the like reality of climate change wasn't like a fact of the reality that like we had clean air and we had clean water, like I would not be looking for a job in like the environmental sector. I would not be like an advocacy leader in the environmental sector because there wouldn't be an issue when it comes to human health, like in all honesty. So I think that a lot of people, like a lot of people in Gen Z are genuinely just trying to do what they can so that they know that like they will have a good life and that their families will have a good life. So I would say like the work that we're doing is really out of necessity. It's not out of I mean, really wanting for anything but those like clean air, clean water. And I would also say in terms of like the diversity of Gen Z, like we do have a lot of diversity, but I think we are kind of rooted in like the same facts that like we all know that to a certain extent the government has failed us and that like adults have failed us, whether that be, you know, like whatever ideological perspective you want to go on. But I think we can all kind of like root around that fact.
So you think there's a lot of unity and skepticism of institutions across sort of the board?
Yes, I wouldn't necessarily say skepticism, more just knowing that like the government doesn't always work for the people, obviously. Like that's just not how it's set up. It's set up in a system of like hierarchy and power that really does not listen to the individuals all the time. I wouldn't say like skepticism as in like conspiracy type thing, but more just like really questioning if our institutions are working for us.
Anthony, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, you know, from my lived experience, I went almost my whole life without understanding mental health. I went almost my whole life, you know, I'm 28, and I didn't know the mind and body were connected. I didn't know that you could breathe and experience stress reduction from breathing skills and techniques. So Generation Z and millennials, I think if we want to understand them, we need to understand that millions of them are now experiencing social and emotional learning in school, starting at 5. And that is very different from the current generations, older generations, those that are in power in the workforce that didn't grow up with any social and emotional learning in schools or in the workplace. So I think from like the understanding like Generation Z and millennials in the workplace, there's absolutely going to be a lot of conflict because there's vast differences in understanding. I think specifically around workplace, the workplace culture itself. I think older generations have been told and conditioned to put your head down and work, and that's it. Or they've been told to and conditioned to sever their life. Work is work, home is home, and don't mix the two. And that isn't the reality, I think, of many what Gen Z and millennial workers are looking for or wanting, especially in the workplace. So I think they'll immediately see and understand a toxic workplace. And when we look in the nonprofit sector, 1 in 4 nonprofits are toxic workplaces. Over 50% are experiencing severe burnout to the point where they're not retaining staff. And 57% of nonprofit workers are considered lonely. Gen Z and millennials are now entering the workforce and soon will be the majority. And within, I think, previous workplace demographic ways of working, there's going to be conflict, and also it's going to be really difficult to retain younger workers in the current state of our how we work.
Got it. So from Esme's standpoint, it's really thinking about the work and how it's happening out of necessity. From your standpoint, Anthony, it's also looking at how the workplace has evolved for our generations. Sim, do you have a perspective on how folks in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector can better understand Gen Z to think about how to sustain the work?
Yeah, I think there's, in my experience, like there is like this need to always sort of be argumentative, or to always like if I'm telling you something, like we don't always need to argue. Maybe you just need to listen. And I also take that like when other people talk to me, like I don't always look out arguments because I don't like unnecessary conflict. I'm fighting, external forces all the time. I don't need conflict in my personal life and my work life. Like it's just not a necessity. And I also I specifically chose to center my work around like my necessity for survival. And so if my workplace is not meeting that need, I'm going to leave. Like there's nothing that's going to keep me there. I'm not tied to a job. If I'm not happy there, I'm not going to stay. And I think I'm not willing to sacrifice that. And a lot of people my age aren't either. Like if you're not treating me correctly, like you clearly don't respect me, I'm not going to respect you, and I'm going to leave. And so I think like if the nonprofit sector, is serious about making space for a new generation of leaders to come in and to actually lead, then let them lead. Like listen to your employees. I don't care if they're fucking interns or lower than you or whatever. Like I think we really need to challenge these hierarchies that haven't worked for us. Like, the patriarchy hasn't worked for us. That's why all of these guys, are in touch with their feelings and have a lot of emotional problems. Like we have these systems that we've taken for granted because they exist, and they're hurting us. Like they're actually hurting us, and they're hurting our longevity of life. They're hurting our reality of life, our conditions. Like nobody's happy. And I think if no one's happy, then why aren't we happy? Like let's get to the root of that. Let's get to the actual things that are causing these problems. And I guarantee you, a lot of these top EDs and high executives or CEOs or like whatever, they're not happy either. Like a lot of them are struggling with stuff too. They have their head so far up their ass they can't admit it. And so I think like in reality, let let the younger generation come in and challenge all of these structures, because that's what we do. Like for generations throughout all time, every single revolution or whatever has been led by young people. So let us revolutionize the nonprofit structure. Let us revolutionize philanthropy. But yeah, that's my perspective.
I really appreciate that perspective. I can see, and we got one last question. I just got to ask you that. I can imagine someone here sitting, listening to this and say, how do you balance hard work with not creating a toxic workplace? Because I can hear people saying and pushing back, and I think it's important to hear that. And they say, look, back in my day, I used to work extra hard. We used to work 60, 70 hours. If you're trying to build something, you got to grind out. How do you balance that with what you're saying? Because I think that it's not necessarily a mutually exclusive debate, but that is something that oftentimes comes up in these conversations when Gen Z brings up the toxicity of a workplace.
Yeah. Who is that directed to?
Go for it. You can go for it, and then I'll switch to it's just because it was most relevant to what you had just said.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I'm not a stranger to hard work. I work probably like 80 hours a week, but it's really like the conditions of the work that I'm doing, right? So every time that I meet with someone, I just have a conversation with someone, I'm connecting with someone, like that's technically organizing, like that's relationship building, and that's work. But it's also just like the conditions of the work that I'm doing. Like I used to compete in hackathons that would last like 48 hours, and I wouldn't be tired at the end of it because I was building something that I was passionate about. It was giving me life, and it was feeding back into me. And so when you work on something that is feeding back into yourself, into your community, and you're sustaining it by building relationships with each other, not being siloed, and not constantly like extracting from each other and just taking from each other, and not respecting each other in the workplace. I think that is like the it's not the work. If the work is healthy and the work is rejuvenating and the work is giving back to the community, it's not the work that's the issue. The work that I feel like is the issue is when you're chasing all these arbitrary deadlines that make you feel like shit when you can't keep up with all of this level of like demand and extraction. So I think really examining like the type of work that you're doing, why are you doing it, like and what is it really investing into you, into your community, into yourself, and like the broader. I think those are very different things, because like not all work is extractive, not all work is toxic, and not all work is, but like some work that leads to a lot of these conditions that we're seeing is exactly that. But yeah, I don't know if someone else wants to take it.
Could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, and I'm also being cognizant of time. And I
Okay.
know Nandita's got a question, but essentially the question was just, Anthony, how do you balance the idea of hard work with what you're claiming is a toxic workplace? Because what a lot of people hear us saying is, well, these guys don't want to work hard. So how do you think through that?
I would say that the first thing that comes to mind is that's probably I wouldn't be focusing on that if I was a leader in terms of how much are you doing hard work. My focus would be around how are we doing together in terms of working together towards our mission. Do we feel like we need more rest? So I think I would reframe that question and focus it in a different way.
And I mean, that really leads into my last question for all of you. Many of the folks who read the Chronicle of Philanthropy are in those positions of leadership and authority, but many of them also want to invest in the next generation. Anthony, how can they be most helpful for you in your journey? And then I'll have everyone else answer too. But Anthony, go ahead.
Yes, I love this question. It's my favorite question. I was delivering a social connection at work training. And what that looks like is bringing people together to connect with each other. Sometimes we sit in circles. I know it's really uncomfortable, and we talk about what we're grateful for. But I got some feedback, and I love feedback. And I was sitting at home in my chair, and I was looking at the feedback, and it said, and the feedback was, this is a great reminder on the importance of soft skills. Soft skills. And I just, you have these moments where you just get rocked by little things. And that was a really insightful moment for me. That we view social connection, that we view community, that we view social support and belonging and empathy and trust as soft skills, when arguably, I would say, it's my opinion, that they're the most important things that we could be doing, especially in the workplace, especially mission-driven work that takes a toll on our mental health and well-being. So what I would say to anyone listening is we desperately, desperately need to see nonprofit workers and workers in philanthropy as whole people. Desperately need to see them as whole people. And there are many ways to do that. So.
Yeah, Esme, do you have anything to add to that in terms of, what would you say to someone who's in a position of leadership, who wants to invest in you, and help you on your journey? How can they best do that and support you?
Yeah, I would say there's like a really common theme that I see throughout my life with people who are older than me telling me that like the climate crisis will solve it, or like me, myself, and like my entire generation will somehow solve the climate crisis that we are not responsible for. So I would say if we can just flip that entire like way of thinking and really think like adults have a place in solving this issue. It may not be like the one where they're speaking all the time or where they're telling us like what solutions are going to be applicable as if they would know, but it's like really taking a supporting role and helping us out. And whether that's, showing up to like our actions, whether that's supporting our groups like financially or showing up. There's so much that like people in leadership positions can do to make a difference. And I've definitely seen like adults, especially in the climate movement, like just completely do amazing with that. Like they show up, they do their own actions, they support like our groups when we need it, but they're not telling us like you're gonna solve this issue that like we're responsible for, because I think that's a lot of pressure. So I would say listening to us and supporting us in any way that you can, and you definitely can listen and you can support, especially in a position of leadership.
Yeah, and not placing all the onus and pressure on you to solve something. Sure. Sim, anything to add?
For sure. I think at the core of this, we're building an intergenerational movement to tackle the climate crisis, and that is like the largest existential crisis that our generation and any generation after us will face, right? And there is a responsibility that I feel like that's basically like right, like it has been passed on to us in a lot of ways, and people tell us, "Oh, we're so inspired by you," yada yada yada. But like, what I really want, and I feel like we really need is like, yes, listen to us, but also like, it's like act on what we say. Like, don't just like say, "I hear you." Like that's so like condescending at this point. Like, I know you hear me, and that's fine, but like, can you actually like do something? Can you help? Because like, I mean, we're literally dying, and people aren't taking this seriously because they want to make, they have their issues that they're focused on, whatever. But I think really calling in the fact that like, if we're not tackling the climate crisis, are like, what impact are you truly going to have? Because there won't be a planet, there won't be people left, there won't be anything left if we don't tackle this. And so I think, yeah, at the root of it, like, listen to what we're saying, but also, take action, because like we need to move now. We don't have a lot of time. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great note to end on. I just want to thank everyone for being so candid and sharing your thoughts and your experiences, ways in which the sector can do better, how to better support you and enact positive change in the areas that, are really, really necessary right now. Manu, did you want to say anything?
No, I'm good. I'll just say that I always appreciate hearing different perspectives and hearing from you all in terms of how you think we can act. I am in the same generation, and I would say that I think the most important thing is for the conversations to keep happening, especially between the intergenerational elements of the philanthropy sector. So thanks to you all, and thanks to the Chronicle of Philanthropy for hosting this.